Hello, it's David Leroy here, and this slide presentation will introduce you to the controversial topic of false confessions. So the controversy begins when we consider what most people think about false confessions. And so if you were to ask people, would you confess to a crime that you didn't commit? Most people would answer no. If you asked me that question, I would say no. And if we then extrapolate that and ask the question slightly differently, and we say, well, do you believe that other people will falsely confess to a crime they didn't commit? Most people would say, no, they wouldn't. And that seems a reasonable position to take. If I wouldn't admit to a crime that I didn't commit, then why would I expect other people to admit to crimes they didn't commit? Within the legal system, it's important to remember that there's lots of benefits to obtaining a confession from suspects. So during an investigation, if someone is suspected of a crime, they may be taken to a police station and interviewed or interrogated. And if during that interrogation your suspect signs a statement to say that they did indeed commit the crime, then that is going to increase the chances of obtaining a conviction. All right? If someone has admitted to the crime, there is going to be less time spent within the legal system processing that case. There are incentives to be able to save money and time if we get a confession from suspects. And there's less work to do. It's operationally much more efficient. If you are investigating a crime, you arrest someone, they confess to that crime, well, that's sort of case over at that point for lots of frontline professionals, and then they can get on to working on the next case that's coming by. And we know that confessions are desirable within the legal system because in lots of different countries, courts offer discounted sentences. So if you're suspected of a crime, you're interviewed about it, and then you admit to that crime quite early on in the legal process, the time and money that you're saving the legal system is recognized, and the reward for the early confession is going to be a substantially reduced prison sentence, for example, or other punishment that is appropriate in the case. So from an investigation point of view, it's seen as quite a good thing to secure confessions wherever possible. But we know that there are some problems with confessions. Now, I would like to first of all draw your attention to an article that's available online, and this was written by Saul Kazin, Stephen Drezen, Thomas Gisley Johnson, Richard Leo, and Alison Redlich. And this is a white paper. These people are some of the world's leading experts on the issues of false confessions, and I would strongly encourage you to download the article and take a look and see what they have to say. I've summarized in this presentation several of the key points that they make. So we know that false confessions are a problem, and we can thank advances in DNA technology that have taken place over the years for helping make this clear. And so what's happened over the previous decades is that technology to analyze DNA has become much more sensitive. And so in cases where samples and specimens have been stored as evidence, scientists have been able to go back years later and do DNA tests that weren't previously possible. And when we look at false convictions that have been proved through DNA exoneration, what we see is that a large percentage of those false convictions had relied on false confessions. Right? So between 15 and 20% of proven false convictions, right, have been the result of somebody admitting to a crime they didn't do. And that is an incredible statistic. So The Innocence Project has been monitoring this for a very long time, and it is widely believed that this figure of 15 to 20% of false confessions is probably representing the tip of a much bigger iceberg, because it is really only a small number of cases that have the DNA evidence that's required to prove or not prove whether someone was guilty or not. So they represent a very small number of cases. So in terms of false confessions, it's believed there's probably millions of people that are affected by it. What's the basic process? How might someone end up falsely confessing to a crime they didn't commit? Well, to have a false confession, you need to have an innocent person to begin with. And that innocent person, for various reasons, might become the subject of interest to the police. The police might take them down to the police station, where they would be interviewed and interrogated about what they knew about the alleged crime. Quite often, because people are innocent, they don't think that they really need any legal advice. All they need to do is, tell the authorities what they know, and then everything will be sorted out. So if you have a feeling of innocence, it's not going to make you raise your guard and perhaps see some of the problems that might arise. So while they're being questioned, there's some attempt to induce or produce a false narrative or a false confession. And in another slide presentation, I can go through the Reid technique with you, which would be an example of a good way to pressure people into confessing to crimes that they did not commit. So people are pressured during those interviews to produce false narratives about what they know. And sometimes the police also lie. So they can say, well, we're just going to say that you confessed anyway, and it's your word against mine. And that can give people an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness. Now, there's some basic protection in the United States. You don't have to say anything when you're being interviewed about a suspected crime. You have the right to remain silent. These are called Miranda rights. I would advise people to exercise those if you live in the United States and you are interviewed about a suspected crime. In the United Kingdom, we don't have the same right. So we have the right to remain silent, but in the United Kingdom, as I understand, inferences can be drawn from your silence, right? Especially when, you want to offer information to authorities at some later point in time. So if you're questioned about a crime and you say no comment, no comment, no comment, if you're asked those same questions, in the courtroom or at some later point in time, and then suddenly you are able to start answering them, people will look at that suspiciously and start to wonder why now you're suddenly able to produce answers when you couldn't earlier. So how do we know a conviction is false? Well, I've talked already a little bit about DNA and the wonderful work that the Innocence Project has done over the years. But often in cases, people discover that no crime was committed in the first place. Maybe there was a crime that was suspected, but then it turns out through further investigation that somebody may not have been murdered. Maybe they've died of natural causes or of an accident or so forth. Sometimes other evidence can come forward. Years later, maybe an alibi will be able to be found. Maybe some new evidence emerges that is able to exonerate somebody. And sometimes the real perpetrators, having got away with the crime because someone else was convicted of it, may go on to commit further crimes, and eventually they become within the sphere of the justice system, and then maybe some tests and admissions are made that then show that a false confession and a false conviction had taken place. But these types of cases, trying to prove someone's innocent after they've been proven guilty, can take years and years and years. And there's plenty of resources on the internet where there are documentaries and so forth of, the journey that people have had to take. And this journey can last for, tens and tens or of years or longer in some cases, because it relies on lots of goodwill and people working for free on your behalf to try and collect all of the evidence that's required. So there are some hypothesized factors that are going to contribute to the probability that someone will falsely confess to a crime. And we call these individual factors, and there's some situational factors too. So some individuals just might be a little bit more prone to providing a false confession. So some people might be a little bit more likely to comply to authority. It may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, people might be particularly frightened of the police, and they may comply with anything that is asked of them. Some people might be more prone to suggestibility, so perhaps during their interviews people can be tricked or pressured through biased questioning into admissions of guilt. We know that adolescents and young people are more likely to provide false confessions, and also if you have an intellectual disability or some form of mental illness, that's going to increase your risk of providing a false confession. And there is also situational factors, so things that might lead somebody to falsely confess to a crime they didn't commit would be just the fact that they've been detained and put into an isolated cell. Anyone that has been put into a room and had a door locked behind them will know just how frightening that can be. You would like to think it doesn't happen today, but in the past we know that sometimes confessions have been elicited through softening up the suspect. So we would call that torture in the world today. In some jurisdictions, you're allowed to present false evidence. So I've done training with investigators who have shared stories of some of the cases they've worked on, and one investigator I worked with told me that his tactic was, after they'd arrested a suspect, is that he would go and get a blank videotape, write the date on it, and then walk into the interview room, slap it on the table and say, look, we've got it all on video, so you better confess to the crime. And he said that worked quite a lot. Other situational factors could include drug addiction. So if you're a heroin user, you're suspected of a crime, you're taken to a police station, all investigators would need to do would be just to wait for a few hours until you needed more heroin, and then they could probably get you to agree to admitting to crimes that you didn't commit, simply because that person might think that they'd be able to get back out on the street so that they can obtain their heroin. And I've mentioned the Reid technique before, but different interviewing techniques can also maximize the chances of getting false confessions, and other inducements. So we've got good cop, bad cop type scenarios. It might be that a suspect is told, look, it's getting late, I know you want to go home, we can wrap all of this up right now. If you just sign this statement, it says you've done it, and then we'll have your parents come and pick you up, and everything will be okay. Well, everything's not going to be okay, because as soon as they've signed that confession, it's almost impossible to retract. So just to draw your attention now to the research of a psychologist called Saul Kazan, has been very influential in the area of helping us understand false confessions. So what's the taxonomy? What are some different reasons people might make false confessions? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Some people are going to enjoy the fame. They will admit to the crime for some reasons known only to themselves. They want to be on television or have some sort of notoriety associated with them. Some people admit to crimes they didn't commit as a form of self-punishment. I'm thinking of, cases like the Friedman case, which you can find online. And this was someone who had admitted to the charge of pedophilia, but he hadn't committed the crimes he was accused of, but he might have committed other crimes in the distant past, and because he felt ashamed of that, he felt that he ought to agree and falsely confess to a new crime. People who have mental illnesses are more prone to making false confessions. And also sometimes, within the cultures of different groups of people, that could be, something that you would want to do to protect somebody else. And I'm thinking of, for example, a gang culture. So it might be the case that, one person is going to go forward and admit to a crime just so everyone else will evade capture. Compliance is also an issue. We know from social psychology experiments in the past, like Ash and Milgram, that we can, get people to comply with demands of people who are in authority. And if you think about a forensic interview situation, you might have, someone who's been arrested. They could be, of a low power, and they're being put into a room with someone they perceive to be very powerful, and that imbalance, right, can cause people to start to comply with demands that are made of them. And especially young people may be induced to make false confessions just to get out of the situation. If you can imagine being, like I said, addicted to drugs, or maybe you don't like being locked up, maybe you've been kept up all night, you're going to find that really, really stressful. You maybe been away from your parents, people who support you, that sometimes it can look as though it would be a good idea just to make that false confession. Mum and Dad will come along, pick me up, and then the lawyers can sort it all out later. But as I've already said, that often doesn't happen. When you make your false confession, it is very difficult to retract. And people can be incentivized. So if you deny people food or sleep and then say, look, if you get all of this done, then we can make your situation a bit more bearable, sometimes people will provide a false confession at that point. And so when people make false confessions, sort of the short-term decisions, these are the types of ones that are very frequently retracted. So as soon as someone is picked up by their mum and dad, they'll explain, look, I only said that I did it so I could get out, but I really didn't do it, right? And so as soon as they escape that situation, they'll revert to telling the truth. And some false confessions are also internalized. So these are very curious cases where a suspect is presented or told that there is evidence that's proving their guilt, and they come to believe the crime even though they can't remember doing it or have no memory of doing it. And these are very curious cases where people come to mistrust their own memory and sometimes even start to form their own false memory of themselves committing the crime. And you think, well, how could somebody end up being able to do that? Well, if you think about, intoxicated witnesses, people who have been out drinking will frequently have the experience of waking up in the morning thinking, oh, what did I do last night? And you've got a memory blank. And then if someone were to say, well, actually, last night when you were at the party, someone was seriously injured and you did it because you were in the room next door. If you don't have like an alibi memory or a memory of exactly what happened, you might just be led to believe that, well, you must have done it, that's the most plausible explanation, and then falsely admit to something that you can't even remember doing. So false confessions are not a problem within the legal system if we can spot a lie. Okay, so if forensic investigators have a belief that they can tell when people are lying to them or not, right, then false confessions aren't going to really be a concern for them. And they're not a concern if we know when people are telling us the truth. And they're also not a concern if we believe that people would never admit to a crime that they didn't commit, right? And so if you have those beliefs, that can lead you to think that false confessions, while theoretically possible, are probably very, very unlikely. But what we have been able to read over the years is research that has sort of tried to unpick some of these ideas. And I'm going to show you, first of all, some research that asks the question whether we can tell whether someone's telling the truth or not, just from listening to what they've got to say and looking at their demeanor. And so by that I mean listening to the suspect. You know, does their story sound truthful or does it sound untruthful? And what about their body language? Is there some sort of clue in there that is telling us whether they're telling the truth or not? Maybe they're talking about something serious, but they smirk. And maybe in your mind you might be able to think, well, you know, you shouldn't be smirking when you're talking about something like that. So that might be a clue as to whether something's true or not. Well, this is precisely the sort of question that psychologists can put under the scientific spotlight. So what does research tell us? I'm going to present you with a few slides now of research that was conducted by Saul Kazin and his colleagues. This study is titled, "I Know a False Confession If I Saw One." And it's a comparison between the judgments that college students make compared to those of police investigators. And so I'm just going to give you a few details now about the makeup of the study, the logic behind the design. What these investigators did is they went to a state penitentiary and enlisted the help of 10 male inmates who were paid to participate in the study. And they were asked to make a videotaped confession of the crime that they had been convicted of. And then they were also given some scenarios of crimes they didn't commit and asked to make a video recording confessing to those. So they were told to provide details about, you know, who did the crime, what happened, where, how, why, etc. So they're just short clips of someone either telling the truth about a crime they did commit, or they're not telling the truth and they're describing a crime that they did not commit. Now, when the researchers had those video recordings, they were able to then play those to other participants in the study and ask them to make decisions as to whether what they were hearing is the truth or not. And in the study, they had enlisted the help of 61 psychology students, and they also enlisted participants who were federal investigators. So these are FBI agents, all of which had more than 10 years experience and training in forensic investigation. So we've got two very different groups of people. So they were all invited to watch the video recordings, and then they were asked, after they'd watched a video recording, in your opinion, is this individual guilty of the crime to which he has confessed, or is he innocent? And they were also asked to make a confidence judgment. So what the researchers are able to do here is collect information about, you know, how accurate people are. You know, are they able to say, yes, this is true, or no, this is not true, to a high degree of accuracy. And the underlying question is, having made those judgments, are you confident that you got your decision correct? And this is the data that was obtained in the research. And so I'm just going to draw your attention here to the judgment accuracy. So if we look at the numbers in the middle row, now we've got the data for students, and then we have the data for forensic investigators. These are the FBI agents. Let's look at the decisions in response to the videos. When these groups of people were played the videos and then asked to make their judgments as to whether what they were seeing was true or untrue, the students were accurate 53% of the time. So that means that after watching a succession of those video clips, they were getting as many wrong as they were right. And the forensic FBI investigators were only 40% accurate. So they were worse than the students. They were most often getting their decisions wrong, which is an alarming finding. Now, what the researchers also did is they turned the video visual part off, and they were left with just audio recordings of the same statements. And they got other people to come along and then just listen to the statement and then decide whether it was a true statement or a false statement. And what we found here is that performance with the students and the FBI agents did increase when the video footage, the visual part of the video wasn't available. But still, the accuracy is very low, so it only increased to 64%. So, taken together, what you would conclude for a rule of thumb is it's about 50-50 chance of being able to tell if someone is telling you the truth or telling a lie. And other studies have been conducted that confirm this finding. So research shows that we're not very good at telling whether people are being truthful based on their demeanor. So there is not much in the way of clues that we can look for that's going to improve our judgments of whether people are telling the truth or not. So can a person be induced to make a false confession? Okay, so what we've learned from the previous study is that we can't tell if someone's telling the truth or not, right? Which is a concern. It's a reality, but it is also a concern. And can people come to believe their own false confessions? Okay, so what is the process that we could use to have somebody admit to something they didn't do? And this is a question that can be put also underneath the experimental spotlight. And I'm going to talk to you about a study that was conducted by Nash and Wade in 2008. And it's called Innocent but Proven Guilty, Using False Video Evidence to Elicit Confessions and Create False Beliefs. It's available online. You should be able to download a copy and find it if you just do basic Google searches, putting the title into the Google search. So the design of the study was interesting. It involved participants, students at a university coming to a research laboratory. They were asked to participate in a study that involved a gambling game that they were to play with a computer. And they were to be sat at a table, and there would be two piles of money. And then the students were told that one pile is the money for the bank, and then they were shown which pile was their own, and then they were told that you want to play this game and try and increase the amount of money you've got, because the next participant that comes in is going to sort of pick up where you left off, and they're going to be wanting to have been left with money so they can gamble too. And here's an example of the questions that they were asked. So they're sat in front of the computer and they're being asked questions. They've got a pile of money in front of them, and then they're asked to make bets. So here's an example of one of the questions of what is retiphobia, the fear. So they've got some different odds. If you're conservative, you would put the odds at 2 to 1. So you're not going to win a lot, but then you're not going to lose too much either. There's some good odds here, but these odds look much longer. So while they would pay out well, perhaps it's not such a good idea to bet on them. So the participants went through this task. The computer would analyze their answer, and then the computer would tell them whether they got it right or wrong. If they got the question right, they were able to take some money from the bank and put it in their own pile. And if they got it wrong, the reverse would happen. They had to pay the bank. So the study finishes. The participants asked to wait outside while the data is being checked, and the researchers had video recorded the participant while they were playing the game, and then using digital editing software, they were able to change this signal here, which said that you got the question correct, so you can take money from the bank, to this one, incorrect, right, where they should be putting money in the bank, but here we can see that they're taking money, and so that technically is cheating. The researchers come back and they show the participant the evidence. They're told their data is going to now be invalid, but for them to be able to be removed from the study, they're going to have to sign a confession, right? But they don't have to sign a confession to say that they cheated. But if they don't, they're going to have to go and see the professor in person and tell them themselves. Now, with that dynamic, that's a pretty simple dynamic. People just being presented with a little bit of false information. But 100% of the participants falsely confessed to this misdeed. That's everybody who went to the psychology lab and then was tricked, admitted to the crime they were accused of. And when they were asked whether they really believed that they had cheated, look, almost just over 2/3 actually believed that they'd done it, having seen the evidence, put their hands up and said, yep, I believe I did that. So we should be concerned about false confessions, right? Absolutely. This is a huge problem for young people in the criminal justice system and people who are vulnerable.